Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath, and today, as the bottom banner says here, is we are going to talk about the case for better meat, why well-raised meat is good for you and good for the planet. And if you listened to last week, I was talking to Will Harris from White Oak Pastures, who raises this better meat. And now we're going to talk to Diana Rodgers. She is a dietitian, filmmaker, author, and sustainability advocate. She is the executive director of the Global Food Justice Alliance and the author of Sacred Cow, the book and the movie. So hello, Diana. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. I don't know how we got introduced to each other years ago, but I've been following you for years, so I'm very excited to be chatting with you. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and explain your passion for sustainable nutrition and regenerative agriculture?
Sure. Yes. Let's see. I'll try to give you the short version of this. Okay. As a kid, I was really malnourished, and I didn't find out until I was 26 that I had celiac disease, which answered a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. And when I went gluten-free, I was still just doing sort of a gluten-free version of the standard American diet that I had been eating. I was trying to be kind of low-fat and eat mostly plant-based, although not entirely, but I was doing it. And I still didn't feel right. Like my stomach felt a little bit better, but I still had these like massive blood sugar kind of roller coasters where I was like starving, and I had to have my gluten-free granola bars on me all the time. And I was eating gluten-free pasta and gluten-free cookies. And it really wasn't until I learned more about this sort of ancestral way of eating where we eat like closer to how our ancestors ate, and not just like grandma, but like going way back to more there's bad connotations sometimes with this paleo type diet, but really it's meat, vegetables, a little fruit, some nuts. That's really what did it for me. At the same time, I was married to an organic farmer. I lived on farms for over 18 years and decided to go back to school to become a dietitian. So I was working in food marketing before that. I worked for Whole Foods Market and in advertising for that. And as I was becoming a dietitian, I noticed this kind of very anti-meat narrative that was happening in school, starting to appear in the media, where, cutting out processed foods was like totally something that was like orthorexia, right? Like this, you couldn't be too overly obsessed with healthy eating, but yet being a vegan or vegetarian was okay, even though all the science that I was looking at was showing that meat has nutrients that you absolutely just can't get from plants. And shouldn't we be getting all of our nutrients from food? And isn't being a vegan a form of restriction, right? So I have friends that are vegan, and I understand not wanting to eat meat for a variety of reasons. But as a dietitian and as a mother and as somebody who really advocates for public health and for sustainable food systems, policies that pull meat out of children's mouths, like Meatless Mondays, programs that tax farmers for their emissions when they're largely plant-based or grass-based, like in New Zealand and in Ireland, how they're going to be culling all these animals there. I've got real problems with that because nutritionally, meat is an important food, and sustainability-wise, we need something to be giving the nutrients to the plants. So I lived on a farm that was an organic vegetable farm. We started raising animals for the fertility that they gave to our vegetables. You can't have kale without some kind of input in there. And you can either do that with chemicals or you can do that with animal manure. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad you had Will on right before me. He's a good friend of mine. I actually sent my son down 2 white oak pastures during COVID to work there.
Oh, wow, cool.
Pull them out of school. And I've done multiple workshops at white oak pastures. So I'm a huge advocate for the type of farming that Will does. But also, and I know we're going to get into this in a little bit, but for people that can't access that type of meat, that like 100% grass-fed, raised on a small farm, that stuff is expensive, and it is a privilege to access that. And so for the families that are struggling to make ends meet, that are working multiple jobs, I still advocate for them to feed their children meat, even if it's grocery store meat, instead of box dinners or other ultra-processed food options.
Well, and that I like the fact that you said the ultra-processed foods, because Nina Curtis, who is a vegan chef, 2 or 3 years ago, I had her on the show, and she's like, we really need to work on the word processed foods, because a can of chickpeas is processed. But it's literally that ultra-processed foods that we're really worried about because of all the extra sugar and salt and things like that, right?
Yeah, and it's more the nutrients that are being stripped away from those foods. So the more perishable, the better, basically, is how I advocate for food. So if it doesn't go bad on the grocery shelf, it's probably not good for you.
Really good point. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Will told us a little bit about how they raise the meat on the farm, et cetera. So the word well raised is in the title of the show. So can you tell us what well raised means? Meat means, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of black and white thinking, right? Like meat bad, but vegetables good, or one thing bad, one thing good. And it's really, as life is much more complicated than black and white solutions. So there's not only one good way and one bad way. So the processes that Will uses on his farm to raise his animals are arguably gold standard. Regenerative agriculture, where the animals are moved frequently, where the pastures aren't just one type of grass, but there are multiple different species of all kinds of things that some people might consider weeds, but they actually contain different nutrients that the animals are eating. And this practice of movement of the animals, so grazing them heavily for a day or two, or sometimes half a day. It really just depends on the practice of what can be done in Georgia is very different than what can be done in Nevada or Vermont, right? I just got back from Calgary. I'll be going to Uruguay next week. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and farms have to be financially sustainable. Also, they have to work with the climate that they're in. So it's really a tricky thing to say, like, well-raised has a definition. And even in some cases, feedlot finishing is not the worst thing in the world, because for every pound of plant-based protein, there are 4 pounds of fibrous waste. Like if you think of a soybean plant, you extract the soy protein, but then you have the seed pod, you have the stalk, you have all these other fibrous pieces of that soy plant that have no other use in our food system. So we could just put them in a pile and burn it, which emits greenhouse gases. They could break down in a compost pile very slowly over time, emitting greenhouse gases. Or things like that can be chopped up and fed to cattle on a feedlot and upcycled into protein, affordable protein that your everyday consumer who maybe can't afford boxes of grass-fed beef shipped to them on a monthly basis. So we have to kind of weigh out the privilege there. So what I tell people to do is buy the best meat they can afford, support the practices that align with their values, and not to demonize meat, because meat itself is evolutionarily appropriate for humans. It contains nutrients you can't get from plants. And there are better and worse ways to raise an animal on grass, to finish an animal on a feedlot. I've been to many feedlots. So I try to just introduce the idea that there's a lot of gray areas and nuance to the entire story, and there's not a good or bad, which is what you're seeing on social media, especially from the Washington Post and the Economist, where they're saying all you have to do is just cut meat out of your diet and then you'll be an environmentally responsible citizen. And that's just overly simplifying and actually irresponsible journalism.
Okay, I want to go back to that and into a post that I saw a couple months ago from you, but I want to, because you mentioned the nutritional benefits. So can you talk about the nutritional benefits of meat?
Yes. So all meat has pretty much the same nutritional benefits. So a lot of people will say that grass-finished beef is significantly more nutritious than typical beef. That's not really the case. There are some small benefits from grass-finished beef, but that doesn't mean that feedlot finished beef is toxic or evil or full of chemicals or going to make you sick. It's just not true. So all meat has bioavailable iron. The best form of iron deficiency among women and children is the top nutrient deficiency in the country. And it's really hard to get enough iron, and you definitely can't get it on a plant-based diet. It's not possible. I've looked at it every way you can, and you can't. Iron deficiency causes fatigue. It causes cognitive development problems. It can cause academic problems in school. It's a really serious nutrient deficiency because we need iron in order to deliver oxygen to our cells. B12 deficiency is another really common deficiency, especially among vegans and vegetarians, because you can't get B12 from plant source foods. You can only get it from animals. And one serving of meat has 100% of the B12 that you need for the day. Right. B12 deficiency can cause permanent brain damage. This is why I'm so passionate about this, and why I think we need a lot more qualified dietitians to be talking when it comes to the anti-meat narrative, because it feels like the right thing to do. It seems like the right thing to do, but there are really serious unintended consequences of preaching this, especially when it comes to school children. Right. So B12 deficiency not only permanent brain damage from nerve damage, but also causes, you need B12 to make serotonin and dopamine and all the happy hormones. And so it leads to even an insufficiency, which is much more common than flat deficiency. But even having low B12 can lead to serious mental illness. And so those are two of them. But also the protein in meat is the highest quality protein. It has all the right amino acids that we need. We absorb it really easily as people because we evolved our brains because of meat. We need DHA, we need B12, we need iron, we need all these nutrients to develop healthy, proper brains. We need vitamin A in the form of retinol, which is only found in animal source foods, in order to develop proper eyesight. And so as omnivores, the human body requires animal source foods. Now, that can be from fish, it can be from other foods, but red meat is one of the best sources of all of those things. Okay.
Well, and for people to understand, for me too, where I come from as well as Thrive, there's a way, people eat in a variety of different ways, and we don't want to bash one or the other. I mean, and so you might be thinking, hey, you push plant-based, but I'm like, people eat meat. And I think you have a case in point too. It's also based on a lot of, and this was in Sacred Cow too, I think, the religious-based reasons that people eat meat and using animals for, there was a whole piece in there about women and they're the sole providers of food for their families and using animals on the farm, et cetera.
Yeah. You want me to go into that a little bit?
Please.
Okay.
That would be great. Yeah, sorry.
So interestingly, Buddhism wasn't always about abstaining from meat. It was really only until reincarnation became part of Buddhism, which wasn't originally part of Buddhism, that then you might be eating your grandmother. And so eating animals was not part of it. But still, what you see in vegetarian India is high animal source consumption. So they're still eating a lot of dairy products. And you can only have dairy products if you have a meat eating culture nearby, because you have to get these animals pregnant and they have to have a baby in order to milk them. And so you need, so you can only have vegetarian India with Muslims nearby to be eating the meat.
Wow. We would never have thought about that, really. Take that for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And today, meat is seen as barbaric, and meat has become a scapegoat for all of our fears of death. Only 30% of Americans have a will. We don't like the idea that death happens, but death happens. It happens in a plant-based food system or a meat-based food system. It's just whether or not you want to accept it, really. Mm-hmm. And so I mean, there are certain meats that I don't want to eat, and I understand that someone might not want to eat a certain type of meat, whether it's for religious reasons or other personal reasons. Maybe they had a moment with a pig one time. But there is a critical threshold of animal source foods that you absolutely have to be eating in order to be healthy for a period of time. So we know that 85% of people who go vegan go back to eating animal source foods after 3 months. So a healthy diet needs to be something that is sustainable. It needs to be culturally appropriate and respect other cultures. And that's what I see a lot with the anti-meat movement is people removing the choice for other people to have meat, imposing their morals on other people. And we as privileged white Americans have a long history of cultural imperialism. And so we need to be very careful of feeling apologetic about eating meat and then taking that choice away from other people who are less advantaged, who don't want to be giving up meat, meat might be a very important part of their culture. So I'm not demanding that everyone eat meat. Certainly I advocate for choice. I do get upset though when I see policies that are restricting meat or sending false messages about the health implications or environmental implications of eating animal source foods when they're not really based in science.
Well, and that brings me to the post that you did. I think it came after COP, right? It was the amount of meat that they were saying that, and it amount to a quarter a day. Is that what it was?
Oh, yeah. I was referencing the Eat Lancet diet, which has been proven nutritionally inadequate, did not take into account cultural differences, also regional differences in food production. So there are many parts of the world where livestock might be the only thing that thrives there, just because you can't crop everything. Americans tend not to understand that not everywhere looks like America. But if you picture the Serengeti, I mean, you can't just plow that up and plant soy burgers in the Serengeti, right? I mean, that's a natural grassland. And there are major damages environmentally that are happening from the plant-based movement too. So all the plant-based food products that are out there, major ones anyway, they're not using organically grown pea or soy protein. They're still using ultra-processed foods. They're using added nutrients that are not as absorbable. And price-wise, they're usually about twice as expensive as the organic grass-fed beef that you might get from a farm like White Oak Pastures.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard to, and there's one quote from the movie, and it's on the tag, or what do you call it? The preview too. It's like, you can't blame people for being confused, right? I mean, there's so many different messages. And one message that I heard from Marion Nestle years ago was that they're marketing messages to get people to eat a specific way, right? And it's hard to digest what is correct.
Right. And so what we're hearing from the plant-based options is that it's healthier, which is not based on science, that it's better for the environment. And there are multiple ways that a food should be assessed for its environmental impact. Water quality issues, soil health issues, workers' rights issues. But interestingly, the plant-based movement has really just zeroed in on carbon emissions. And that's just one small aspect of the overall picture of everything. And it tends not to account for the fact that farms like Will's actually sequester more carbon than they emit. But they're only looking at the straight emissions and not a fertilizer use, the pesticide use, the destruction of entire ecosystems in order for a big field of soy or wheat or corn to be produced. And then there's ethical considerations about how animals are treated, which are legitimate. But there's also ethical implications of telling people who have less privilege than you that they shouldn't be eating meat based on inaccurate science.
Well, and nutrition is a relatively new science at that, right? I mean, newer than electricity, and understanding it, and everybody's body is different. So how do we apply, how can we apply an overall general thought process on this is what everybody should eat when everybody's body is different?
Everybody's bodies are different to a certain extent, but all bodies need bioavailable iron and will suffer from iron deficiency if meat is pulled out from the diet. Everyone needs B12, absolutely everyone. And if B12 is not taken in, it'll take a little time, but you will develop mental health problems. So yes and no, everybody is different. I mean, that's like saying every dog is different, but dogs, it seems that we are starting to understand a little bit more. You see all these ads on social media for like natural dog food, and people are getting like unprocessed dog food that they can just feed their dogs. We're understanding there are certain nutrients that dogs need, but humans are also an animal that have an evolutionarily appropriate diet that we're meant to thrive on. We are omnivores and we need a wide variety of all kinds of different foods. So there are different food preferences based on how you were raised. But as far as everybody being different, it's not really the case. I mean, everyone needs a base level of protein. Most people aren't getting enough protein. We all need certain types of different fats in order for our brain to function properly. We need a certain amount of sleep and sunlight and all of these things. So there are base generalities you can make. Unfortunately, big food has gotten in there and has impacted our perception of what is normal. And so now when you go to the grocery store and you see someone loading up with the typical food you see in the middle of the grocery store, I mean, if this is the whole length of human existence, we've only been eating food from a grocery store for like the length of my fingernail. Before that, it was whatever you could catch and whatever you could find on a bush, right?
Right.
And we didn't have a lot of the modern diseases that we have today from overconsumption. We're seeing overconsumption, yet nutrient depletion at the same time. Obesity is a form of malnutrition. Mm-hmm. And that's really just because we're not honoring the fact that we are animals that have an evolutionarily appropriate diet.
I love that. It's really important that we understand what we need nutritionally wise, because a lot of the food that we do eat is not nutrient dense, right? And everything on the outside is got a lot more nutrients. Outside of the grocery store, I should say, is a lot more nutrient dense than what's in the middle of that. So what on that protein, how much should we be getting on a daily basis?
Well, there's a lot of people calling for a revision of the dietary guidelines for protein intake right now, because the science that they used in order to calculate protein requirements was based on nitrogen balance studies. So they were looking at the amount of protein people ate, and then they would measure their urine for protein excretion. And they found that when that was in balance, that was all the protein you needed. But what we're learning today is that the RDA for protein is actually the minimum amount you need in order to avoid disease. So 0.8 grams per kilogram is the minimum. And because Americans don't like kilograms and all that kind of stuff, a lot of people have simplified this to 54 grams of protein, or 45 for women, 54 for men or so. But that's based on ideal body weights, which are for women, 125 pounds, and for men, 154 pounds.
Oh, that's not realistic.
So the average weight of a woman is 166 pounds in the US, and the average weight of a man is 195. So even if we're eating at the minimum, we should be eating about double what the RDA is. Oh, that's about 100 grams per person per day.
Okay.
100 grams of protein for someone like you or me would look like about 4, 5, or 6 ounces of animal source foods 3 times a day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And an egg would be how many?
6 grams.
Okay. Wow.
That's a lot of eggs. People think that if they're eating an egg, they're having a high protein breakfast, and eggs are very healthy for a lot of reasons, but they're not one of the best sources of protein.
What are great sources of protein besides we're going to put cows on the top there, right?
I mean, fish are really great too. Fish has its own. I mean, it's funny how seafood seems to get this halo when people are talking about different types of animal proteins, when there are no humane slaughter standards for seafood. So the fish can be killed. However, there's major workers issues with human slavery going on in the seafood industry. And there's major just sustainability stocking issues with both farmed and wild seafood fisheries. But fish in the whole seafood category, or bivalves in particular, are one of the best sources of protein and one of the most nutrient dense sources of protein. So I would put seafood at the top, and then red meat at the next category, beef and lamb, organ meats, things like that. And then at the bottom of the classical kind of what a typical American would eat, chicken actually is relatively low for nutrition It actually is about 30% less nutritious than red meat, has a lot more omega-6s or the inflammatory fats because birds eat seeds. From an environmental standpoint, chickens eat 100% grain. And so when you look at the life of even a cow finished on a feedlot, the majority of their life is still spent on grass. And most of what they're eating doesn't compete with us for edible food, where chickens, it's 100%. And also ethically, those chickens, I mean, unless they're from a farm like White Oak Pastures, which end up being extremely $30 a chicken, something like that. A typical chicken only lives 5 weeks before it is slaughtered. And so their entire life is spent indoors. There's a major antibiotic usage, all this kind of stuff. So on all 3 levels, nutrition, environment, and ethics, I would say you're better with the grocery store beef than you are with the chicken.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. So I don't know what question I want to go with next. So advice do you have for people who want to make more sustainable and health conscious choices? I mean, you just gave that list of the proteins. Well, that actually answers it when it comes to meat. So it's choosing that fish and then that grocery store beef or whatever you can afford beef wise. I think that's really important to understand because sustainability wise, I mean, I think that the entire food system needs an overhaul on how we do sustainability practices in general. But I think you just gave some great advice.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just not as simple as choosing a plant over choosing an animal. Death is going to happen, whether it's from pesticides and all the chemicals that are used that are killing. I mean, the Audubon Society has even paired up with beef producers because they understand that it's monocropping of soy, wheat, and corn across the Midwest that is actually making our wild bird populations diminish because there's just no food for these birds as they migrate. But on a cattle ranch like Will's or cattle ranchers who are even have cow operations before these animals are finished at a feedlot, these are just natural habitats where grazing animals have been for thousands and thousands of years. We've just replaced the bison with cattle, but they're performing very similar ecosystem functions. And there's been studies to show this. And so just saying choose the plant over the meat is really not that simple. I mean, I do have a course called Sustainivore that people can learn about how to eat for your body and for the diet. I advocate for, as I mentioned, a much higher protein than typical. And the reasons I do is that you're going to get more nutrition if you eat higher protein from animal source foods, just because of the B12 and all the other great nutrients that meat has. But it also fills you up for less calories than any other food. So protein is the most satiating of all the macronutrients. So carbs, fat, or protein, it's protein that makes you feel full. And in clinical trials in hospitals where they use calorie restriction, yes, that works. But like out in the wild, like people go to their refrigerator when they're hungry or when they're bored. If you have relatively boring food in there, like meat and vegetables, as opposed to mac and cheese, potato salad, like all the things that you would think like on a all-you-can-eat buffet, like the things that people are going up for seconds and thirds. It's usually not the roasted chicken and the steamed broccoli. It's usually like the potatoes slathered in cheese and the desserts, the things like that. So it's that carb and fat combination. So kind of avoiding those types of foods and sticking with relatively simple meals that are just focused on their nutrition. And then again, buying the most sustainable options you can. So if you can afford it, organic broccoli, of course, is better than typical broccoli, but you would never hear a doctor say, only eat organic broccoli or don't eat broccoli, right? A doctor would never say that. As a dietitian, I can't tell you only eat grass-fed beef or don't eat beef because that would be unethical. Beef is really healthy. It's really nutritious. And as you mentioned in my film, we do talk about the better ways to graze animal. So there's kind of different arguments that you need to kind of suss out, whether it's nutrition or ethics or environment.
Well, and that's really important for people. I'm going to put the link to Sacred Cow in the comments here so everybody can watch it. And it's available on Amazon is where I watched it. It was great. And I actually sent it to one of my farmers who I actually helped process chickens a couple of weeks ago, and they have pork, and she cried. through the whole thing and just saying she was so proud of what she's doing and what she and her husband are doing at their farm. So how can you give some examples of where you've seen change in people's nutritional, their body, communities that have adopted this thought process and helped them feel better?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen major weight loss success stories from people who were really food addicted. These ultra processed foods are on the market out there today are bypassing our natural satiety cues and make us overeat. They just do. And there's really smart people working at these labs that know the bliss point of certain foods, like making sure you can't eat just one of those Pringles or the chips, or something like that.
Right.
So really excluding those foods for a period of time to kind of readjust your taste buds. Because if you think about it today, and my co-author, Rob Wolf, mentioned this in the film Sacred Cow, for $5, you can go have the flavor experience that like thousands of years ago, only like a pharaoh of Egypt would have had at his access, right? But these fast food meals are so ridiculously delicious that we don't even understand how many calories we're actually taking in. It's like activating the reward center in our brains. And it's really important to break that cycle by never birthday cake on your birthday, for example, or having a food celebration when it's a holiday, but it doesn't need to be a daily occurrence, and really just kind of stripping it back down to basics and breaking those food addictions. So to be able to go from breakfast to lunch without a snack, to be able to miss lunch, like right now it's, maybe 1:30 in the afternoon. I haven't had anything to eat since 6 o'clock this morning, and I'm fine. My body's not dying. And I know that previous to that, as I was mentioning earlier, when I first just went gluten-free, I was still, even though I was gluten-free and following the advice of the dietitian that I met with, I needed to eat like every 2 hours or else I felt shaky, I felt weak. And now it's dinner tonight is whatever meat and vegetable are going to be in the fridge. And it doesn't need to be something that I'm obsessing about, that I'm like craving, that it's going to be this ridiculous food experience for me every single night, even though I'm a cookbook author and I make amazing food. I make recipes. I can make an incredible pavlova, but pavlova is like a birthday thing. It's not a daily or weekly thing.
Okay, so when you said the snacks in the middle, so there's a whole conversation with meeting planners, because a lot of my listeners are meeting planners, that when we have an event, we serve breakfast break, lunch break, dinner, right? And there's this whole plethora of it. But the cost of food is astronomical. There's people who are paying $199 for a gallon of coffee, which turns out to be $21 per cup of coffee. So that's a whole nother thing. But what could we serve? And the typical breakfast and the cheapest breakfast is that Continental breakfast, which is loaded with...
It's just carbs. There's no protein with that at all.
Right, exactly.
Meetings are my biggest nightmare in the world. And even when I go to nutrition meetings, and if you think about this blood sugar roller coaster, it's pastries, blood sugar crash, coffee and donuts, blood sugar crash, sandwiches and chips, maybe some soda or iced tea or lemonade, blood sugar crash, afternoon snack, blood sugar crash, dinner. By the end of the day, you are completely exhausted. And I think we need to really suss out to like cost of food versus nutrient value, right? Because those are two separate conversations. And unfortunately, even when I was becoming a dietitian, we are trained in food procurement as dietitians, because all the people that run the hospital and school lunch programs, whatever, are dietitians. So I went through those classes where you have to take the lowest bid, all these kinds of things, institutional food service. That's ridiculous. We're not talking about keeping people healthy. And like I said, even when I go to nutrition conferences, I am horrified. And I happen to have celiac disease, so there's nothing I can eat anyway. So I just assume that I'm going to be allergic to all the food, and that way I'm actually better off. So if I could have my dream day conference, it would be starting the day with an actual egg-based breakfast, or if it needs to be like a grab-and-go cold thing, I would have hard-boiled eggs and a plain yogurt that people could add nuts and other things too. And I would eliminate the juice. Grown-ups do not need to be drinking juice. It's not giving us any nutritional value. So that's how I would start it. For like a snack, if people, we really should be able to go from breakfast to lunch without a snack. I get that people are bored in meetings and they want to put something in their mouth as like a distraction from how boring the meeting is. Unfortunately, I mean, I would have a movement break instead. But, I might have some bone broth as an option to drink instead of coffee or in addition to the coffee. And instead of all the pastries and everything, I would, again, maybe consider something like a plain yogurt. And I know this is why I'm not a meeting planner, right?
I need you to be one.
Crudité, like let's chomp on some fruit or some vegetables with a dip, something like that. For lunch, I would do a buffet-style hot lunch instead of sandwiches where people can have their choice of different proteins mixed with vegetables and a salad. You avoid the afternoon crash if you don't pump them full of sugar and carbs for it. And there's not that carbs are evil, but we eat way too many carbohydrates than we actually need. And it makes people sleepy and about an hour after. An afternoon snack, I would do maybe fruit and cheese, charcuterie board, things like that, maybe some dark chocolate with some nuts. And then dinner, again, would be like meat and vegetables. And if there had to be a dessert, it could be something really small and not these like
pieces of cake that are this big.
Yeah, I have to say meetings are and then I go to a lot of conferences. I travel a lot. And I was just on the phone. I mentioned I'm going to be in Uruguay next week. They have the highest meat consumption in the world. And I mentioned to them that I'm celiac, that I can't have sandwiches. And they were like, oh, no, we don't do that. We don't do that. It's going to be barbecued meat. And so I'm very excited to be meeting with their parliament and talking about global nutrition and malnutrition with policymakers there.
Is there any country that you've been to that's doing a really good job at this?
Of dietary guidelines.
Yeah.
I mean, I like Brazil's dietary guidelines. I've been to Brazil. I think the food of all the places I've traveled so far is my favorite because it's largely meat, maybe some beans and rice and a nice big salad. Costa Rica tends to be like that too. Unfortunately, Brazil's sugar consumption is also the highest in the world. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there between, but they have a lot of poverty in Brazil. And we also see, I mean, the biggest marker for longevity and overall health is socioeconomic status. So the more access you have to healthcare, the more delayed gratification you have with your food. So it's all about that delayed gratification and knowing that if I eat healthy now, I won't get diabetes in 10 years from now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess on how I eat in the United States is amazing. So it just depends, I guess, on what circles you travel in.
Right. Exactly. Well, okay. This has all been really interesting, and I wish the cost of food is there, and we've got to figure out that. And institutional food services is what we all talk about, right? When we're serving large groups of people. So figuring that out. And my friend Aurora does food waste studies, which is the biggest challenge. And unfortunately, crudité is one of the prolifically problematic foods that goes uneaten, and a lot of it's trashed. So figuring that out, balancing this out is really important. So I so appreciate what you're doing and how you're educating people on the nutritional value of meat, as well as how it's nutritionally valuable to the planet. So thanks.
Thank you.
Is there anything any final takeaways that you'd like to share with people?
I mean, I hear that crudité it is something that maybe doesn't fly with a lot of people, but I still think it's worth trying, and it's still worth trying other options. And maybe it's a cheese and our charcuterie platter, and I understand those are more expensive, but really pushing back on people, especially if the meeting is healthcare, nutrition. I mean, my gosh, I'm again, just so embarrassed about how many nutrition or health-related events that I've gone to with people eating danishes and donuts and bagels as the breakfast or morning snack. I think we can do better than that.
Yeah, I remember actually being in a session where a doctor he went to the obesity conference and for doctors, and they were serving donuts and brownies and everything. Like, you're here to talk about obesity and you're feeding us the foods that make us obese. So yeah, crazy. So the question that I ask everybody is, what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food system mean to you?
I'm glad you included the word inclusive, because that's what I do at Global Food Justice Alliance. Is I advocate for the right of all people to have access to culturally appropriate, regionally sustainable foods. And in many cases, that means the inclusion of meat, not shaming people about that. So, I mean, every day, that is my nonprofit. And that's not to say I'm against vegetables. I advocate for people to also eat produce as well, fresh produce. But we have such a war against meat right now, and it is so not fair and so unjust to the nutrition, especially of women and children across the world.
That's really good to know. And I just put it up on the screen, and I put it in the chat as well, how to get a hold of Diana with the globalfoodjustice.org. Thank you very much. Good luck with traveling, and be safe. Yep. And everyone, this is the Eating at a Meeting podcast, and this is Diana Rodgers. You can reach her, I'm going to show that again, at the globalfoodjustice.org. And check out Sacred Cow, the book that's behind her head right there, and the movie, which you can find on Amazon. It was worth my hour and 20 minutes, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's very worth the time. So, Diana, I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And until next time, stay safe and eat well.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.